Now, I've lived long enough to know that the richest man in the valley ain't always the one with the biggest house or the fanciest boots. Sometimes wealth wears patched overalls and speaks in whispers, hiding itself so deep that even the angels might miss it. This here's a story about the kind of riches that can't be counted in silver dollars, and the woman who almost walked away from more treasure than she ever dreamed possible. You see, there are secrets that men carry like stones in their pockets, growing heavier with each passing year. And sometimes it takes watching everything fall apart before a man finds the courage to set those stones down and show the world what he's really made of. So pour yourself something strong and lean in close, because what I'm about to tell you happened when the autumn leaves were dying and hope seemed as scarce as water in the desert. Eleanor Ashford had always prided herself on being the kind of woman who could weather any storm. She'd buried 2 babies before they could walk, nursed her husband through the consumption that finally claimed him, and still managed to keep their small spread running with nothing more than grit and prayers. But standing in her front parlor that grey October morning, watching Sheriff Henderson read the foreclosure papers, she finally understood what it meant to be truly beaten. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Ashford," the sheriff said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd delivered too much bad news in his lifetime. "Bank's been patient, but with all of William's gambling debts coming to light," he trailed off, unable to finish what they both knew. Her husband hadn't just died of consumption, he'd died owing money to half the territory. Eleanor's fingers tightened on the door frame as she watched the sheriff's deputies begin loading her furniture onto their wagon. The rocking chair where she'd nursed her babies, the kitchen table where she and William had shared their morning coffee for 15 years, the wedding quilt her mother had sewn, stitch by careful stitch. "How long do I have?" she asked, proud that her voice didn't shake. "End of the week, Friday. 3 days, 3 days to figure out how to start over with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of bitter disappointment." From across the fence line that separated her failing homestead from the neighboring spread, Ezra Cole watched the proceedings with the kind of careful attention most folks reserved for studying weather signs. Ezra wasn't much to look at, a lean man pushing 50, with hands that knew hard work and boots that had seen better decades. His own place was modest at best, a small cabin, a few head of cattle, and pastures that looked like they'd been carved out of stubbornness and hope. Most folks in the valley figured Ezra was just another dirt-poor rancher, scraping by on beans and determination. He kept to himself, spoke little, and seemed content to live quietly on the margins of respectable society. Eleanor had been his neighbor for 8 years, and their conversations had never stretched beyond polite nods and comments about the weather. But what the valley didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Ezra Cole was carrying a secret heavier than a millstone. 23 years ago, he'd struck gold in the Colorado mountains. Not fool's gold or wishful thinking, but the real thing, a vein so rich it had made him wealthy beyond most men's dreams. He'd sold his claim quietly, invested the money carefully, and bought land all across the territory under different names. The modest cabin and struggling ranch were nothing more than window dressing, a way to hide in plain sight from the kind of folks who'd want to separate a rich man from his money. He'd learned early that wealth attracted the wrong kind of attention, gold diggers and schemers, distant relatives who suddenly remembered his name, and men who thought a rich man's money was easier to take than to earn. So Ezra had chosen simplicity over splendor, solitude over society. But watching Eleanor Ashford lose everything while he had more than enough to help 10 families, that was testing his resolve in ways that 23 years of careful hiding hadn't. That evening, as Eleanor sat on her front porch watching the sun set over land that would soon belong to someone else, she noticed Ezra approaching her fence with something in his hands. "Evening, Mrs. Ashford," he called out, his voice rough from disuse. "Mr. Cole," she managed a tired smile. "I suppose you heard about everything." He nodded, then held up what he'd brought, a small basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Figured you might not feel much like cooking tonight. Made some stew, more than I can eat." It was such a simple kindness that Eleanor felt her carefully maintained composure crack just a little. "That's very thoughtful of you." Ezra set the basket on the fence post between their properties, then stood there for a moment, shifting his weight like a man wrestling with words that didn't want to come. "Mrs. Ashford," he finally said, "if you don't mind me asking, where will you go? After Friday, I mean." Eleanor looked out at the horizon, where the mountains rose like purple promises against the dying light. "I have a sister in Kansas City. She'll take me in, I suppose. Help me find work in one of the factories." The thought of leaving this big sky country for the smoky confines of the city made her stomach turn, but pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Friday morning arrived, grey and cold, with the kind of wind that cuts through a person's clothes and settles in their bones. Eleanor had spent the previous 3 days packing what little the bank had allowed her to keep, a satchel of clothes, her mother's Bible, and a daguerreotype of her and William on their wedding day, back when they'd believed love could conquer anything. The stagecoach to Kansas City was due at noon, and Eleanor was determined to be on it. She'd already said her goodbyes to the neighbors who'd bothered to come by, endured their well-meaning but hollow promises to write, and accepted their small offerings of food and coins with as much grace as she could muster. She was sweeping the front porch one last time when she heard the jingle of harness and the creak of wagon wheels. Looking up, she expected to see the stagecoach arriving early. Instead, she saw something that made her question her own eyes. Ezra Cole was driving toward her house, but this wasn't the humble farm wagon she was used to seeing. This was a fine carriage, pulled by a matched pair of chestnuts that probably cost more than most men made in a year. Ezra himself looked different too, clean-shaven, wearing a suit that fit him like it had been tailored in Denver, and carrying himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd never known want. The carriage stopped in front of her gate, and Ezra stepped down with the fluid grace of someone comfortable with fine things. In his hands was a leather portfolio that looked official and expensive. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, touching the brim of what was now clearly a quality hat. "Might I have a word?" Eleanor set down her broom, confused, and suddenly aware of how shabby her own appearance must seem. "Of course, Mr. Cole. Though I'm afraid I don't have much time. The stage—" "Won't be necessary," Ezra interrupted gently. "That is, if you're willing to hear what I have to say." He opened the portfolio and withdrew a thick sheaf of papers. Eleanor recognized the bank's letterhead immediately, and her heart sank. Had Ezra come to claim her land as well? Had he bought her debt from the bank? "Mrs. Ashford, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you years ago." Ezra's voice was steadier now, as if he'd finally made peace with whatever words were coming. "My name isn't really Ezra Cole. Well, it is, but it's not the whole truth." Eleanor stared at him, trying to reconcile this well-dressed stranger with the simple rancher she'd known for 8 years. "The truth is, I'm Ezra Cole of Coal Mining and Investment. You might have heard the name in the newspapers. We own mines from Colorado to Nevada, cattle ranches from Texas to Montana." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Eleanor gripped the porch railing, her mind reeling. I don't understand. 23 years ago, I struck it rich, richer than any man has a right to be." Ezra's voice was quiet, almost ashamed. "But wealth, it changes how people see you, changes how they act around you. Everyone wants something. Everyone's got an angle." He gestured toward his modest cabin. "So I built that place, bought a few head of cattle, and pretended to be just another struggling rancher. It was the first peace I'd known since the money came." Eleanor's legs felt suddenly weak. She sank into the chair on her porch, staring at this man who'd been hiding in plain sight for nearly a decade. "Why are you telling me this now?" Ezra looked down at the papers in his hands, then back up at her. "Because I've spent the last 3 days watching you pack up your life, knowing I could fix everything with the stroke of a pen, and I realized that all the money in the world don't mean nothing if you can't use it to help the people who matter." He held out the papers. These are the deeds to your land, all of them. I bought your debt from the bank this morning. The house is yours again, free and clear. The cattle too, if you want them back." Eleanor's hands shook as she took the documents. Her eyes blurred as she tried to read the legal language, but one thing was clear: her name was on the ownership line. "I can't. This is too much. I could never repay." "There's nothing to repay," Ezra said firmly. "But there is something I need to ask you." Long pause, letting the weight of the moment settle. Ezra removed his hat and held it in both hands, suddenly looking more nervous than she'd ever seen him. "Eleanor, Mrs. Ashford, I know this is sudden. I know you've got every reason to think I'm some kind of fool or schemer. But the truth is, I've been watching you for 8 years, watching how you handled your troubles with grace, watching how you treated your neighbors with kindness, even when your own world was falling apart, watching how you never gave up, never stopped fighting." He took a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "I'm asking, would you consider staying? Not just because of the land, but because, well, because I'm tired of pretending to be poor when what I'm really poor in is companionship. I'm tired of hiding who I am, and I'm tired of watching the finest woman I've ever known pack up her life when she belongs right here." Eleanor sat in stunned silence, the deed papers fluttering in the autumn wind. Around her, the world she'd thought she was leaving forever suddenly looked different, not like a place of failure and loss, but like home. "You've been watching me," she finally managed. Ezra's cheeks reddened slightly. Not in any improper way, just noticing. The way you sang while you worked in your garden. The way you always had a kind word for the children who cut through your pasture on their way to school. The way you never complained, even when things got hardest. Eleanor looked at this man, this stranger who wasn't a stranger, and tried to reconcile everything she thought she knew with the truth standing before her. "Ezra," she said slowly, "are you asking me to marry you? I'm asking you to give me a chance to prove that money ain't the most valuable thing a man can offer a woman." His voice was steady now. "Sure, I'm asking if you might consider letting me spend whatever years I got left trying to make you happy." Eleanor stood up from her chair, the deeds still clutched in her hands. She walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the land that was somehow hers again, then at the modest cabin where one of the richest men in the territory had chosen to live as simply as a monk. "Why me, Ezra? You could have any woman you wanted. Beautiful women, educated women." "I don't want any woman," he interrupted gently. "I want you, the woman who can birth a calf in a snowstorm and still have supper on the table by sunset. The woman who reads Bible stories to her chickens because she says they look lonesome. The woman who's got more strength in her little finger than most men have in their whole bodies." Eleanor felt tears on her cheeks, the first she'd allowed herself to shed since William's funeral. But these weren't tears of grief or despair. These were tears of something she'd almost forgotten the feel of hope. "The stagecoach will be here soon," she said. "I can send word that you won't be needing it." Eleanor looked at Ezra Cole, really looked at him. Behind the clean-shaven face and fine clothes, she could still see the quiet neighbor who'd brought her stew and never asked for anything in return, the man who'd hidden his wealth so completely that he'd lived like a pauper rather than risk being wanted for the wrong reasons. "Ezra Cole," she said, and her voice was stronger than it had been in months. "Are you telling me you've been rich this whole time and chose to live like you were poor?" He nodded. "And you're willing to give up that secret, give up your privacy and your peace for me?" In a heartbeat. Eleanor walked down the porch steps and across the yard to where Ezra stood beside his fine carriage. She stopped close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, close enough that she could smell the soap he'd used to clean up for this moment. "Well then," she said, reaching up to straighten his tie, "I suppose we'd better send word to Reverend Patterson. Tell him we'll be needing his services." Long pause, like the settling of dust after a long journey. They were married the following Sunday in the little white church, with half the valley in attendance, and the other half still trying to figure out how dirt-poor Ezra Cole had suddenly become rich enough to buy the Ashford place and throw a wedding feast that would be talked about for years. Eleanor wore her mother's wedding dress, let out and taken in to fit her older, wiser self. Ezra wore his finest suit and a smile that made him look like a man who'd finally stopped carrying stones in his pockets. On their wedding night, as they sat on the porch of Eleanor's house, their house watching the stars appear one by one over the valley, Eleanor asked the question that had been weighing on her mind. "Ezra, why did you really tell me? You could have bought the debt anonymously, let me keep the land without ever knowing it was you." Ezra was quiet for a long moment, holding her hand in both of his. "Because I learned something these past 8 years, watching you live your life with such grace," he finally said. "I learned that the real poverty ain't having no money, it's having no one to share your blessings with. I've been the poorest rich man in the territory, and I was tired of it." He squeezed her hand gently. "Besides, what good is all that money if I can't use it to keep the woman I love from having to work in some factory in Kansas City?" Final pause, like embers settling in a dying fire. They lived together for 27 years after that. Ezra and Eleanor Cole built a fine house on the ridge where they could see both their original properties, raised cattle and horses, and quietly used Ezra's wealth to help neighbors through hard times, always anonymously, always without fanfare. When Eleanor passed first at the age of 73, Ezra had these words carved on her headstone: "She taught me that the richest man is not the one who has the most, but the one who needs the least except love." Voice growing softer, more reflective. Now, I've told you this story not because it's the most dramatic tale I know, though watching a woman's whole world change in the span of an afternoon surely has its moments, but because it reminds us that the most valuable things in life often come disguised as ordinary. Sometimes the richest person in your neighborhood is the one who looks like they have the least. Sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with passion but with simple kindness between neighbors. And sometimes, just sometimes, when everything seems lost and you're ready to pack up your dreams, that's exactly when life decides to show you what real treasure looks like. The frontier's full of stories about men who struck it rich and lost their souls in the process. But this one's about a man who found his fortune and then spent the rest of his life learning that the only wealth worth having is the kind you can share with someone who sees you, not for what you own, but for who you are. Trust me on that. I've seen how this story ends, and it's worth more than all the gold in Colorado.